it is my pleasure to introduce someone who really needs no introduction to this group, and that is Vicki Ramos-Harris. She is the Associate Director of Educational Equity at the Advancement Project, and she leads policy advocacy for early childhood, systems alignment across early childhood and TK-12, dual language learner, English learner, and bilingual education and racial equity. So she's got a very big and important job, and she does it all with a lot of grace and high performance. So please welcome Vicki Ramos-Harris.
Good morning. Really? Try that again. Good morning. Good morning. I'm Vicki Ramos-Harris, and in the spirit, I'm Vicki Ramos-Harris. In the spirit of Global California 2030, I'm with Advancement Project California. Buenos dias, bon dia, buongiorno, welcome. So I'd like to begin with a quick story. So my good friend, Ruby, she's like my sister. We went to college and grad school together. We both have curly hair, we're the same height, we love dancing. We don't look anything alike, but people say we're twins sometimes. Ruby is raising her daughter, Karina, to be bilingual. And Ruby and a couple members of her family speak to Karina entirely in Spanish. So there's Karina. And Karina's father, Carl, speaks to Karina and like the rest of the world, speaks to Karina in English with a little bit of Spanish, right? So she has a lot of Spanish in her life and a lot of English in her life. And the problem is that as Karina has gotten older, she's actually chosen to speak less and less Spanish. And even though Ruby or anyone else who speaks to her in Spanish, she understands, but she responds in English. And sometimes Ruby shared that she'll say, "Mommy, can you say that in English? Can you tell me how to say that in English?" And Ruby will gently say, "No, mija, I want you to be bilingual like me." And so she'll continue. Wow, I was not ready for that. She continues and has persevered to talk to her in Spanish. And so that was up until a couple months ago. A couple months ago, Karina began her first day of preschool in a bilingual program. So this is Karina and her first day in a bilingual program. After 3 days, she started speaking in both languages proudly. 3 days. Ruby was concerned about, was she gonna feel safe? Was she gonna cry? She just was so happy. And so it really helps remind me that children hear loud and clear what we value in our communities and in our schools. So Karina is what we refer to as a dual language learner in early childhood and as an English learner in the TK-12 system. As many of you know, California is home to the largest population of children learning English in addition to their home language in the entire nation. We have 60% of our children, birth to 5, are dual language learners. And as we know, we have 1.3 million English learners across our state. So we're very clear that California is uniquely positioned to lead the nation in advancing policy and practice for these students, and also to build the bilingual, multilingual state that Global California 2030 talks about. So thank you, Glenn, for coming to share a little bit about what California is doing under the leadership of Superintendent Torlakson and your team. So for us at Advancement Project, this conversation is a really critical part of educational equity conversation. It impacts so many of our students of color. So we think about brain science, right? It tells us that home language is critical for success in school and in life, but historically we have stripped children of their home language in pursuit of English. And this has not only been a painful process, but when you look at the data and you look at where our English learners are, the data is really clear. This is not working. On the other hand, it's really powerful to see joyful learners in classrooms where kids are they're in classrooms where their environment is embracing their language, embracing their culture, and embracing their families as a central part of what it is to be a successful student. So we are, when we're putting them in these spaces, we are also telling them loudly and clearly what we value. So we're making some important progress in California, and we've heard a little bit about that from Glenn. We'll hear a little bit about that from this panel. But it's really exciting that almost 74% of California voters supported Proposition 58, which means we have a lot of support across the state to make sure we're getting this right for kids. So we are so honored to have Dr. Lori Olson provide an overview of the journey of this conversation in California with a historical context that's really rooted in racial justice and economic justice. Dr. Olson is she is a researcher with numerous publications on educational equity. Her expertise is rooted in over 4 decades of experience providing technical assistance, professional development of powerful programs for English learners spanning from preschool through community college. She is the creator of the SEAL model, which has been recognized nationally. And she was also the co-chair of the state work group that developed the California English Learner Roadmap Policy. So it is my great honor to welcome Dr. Lori Olson.
Good morning, everyone. This is a pivotal, I'd even say urgent moment for English learner education in our state with the new English Learner Roadmap, which represents a profound paradigm shift and a major equity leap for, whoops, I forgot to here we go. For the 2.6 million students in our schools who have a home language other than English, the 1.3 million English learners. And when you look at our state, and realize that these are students throughout the state, although the numbers and concentrations differ. And think about that statistic that, that Vicki just shared, which is 60% of those children from 0 to 5 have at least one immigrant parent. You realize you can't really talk about California education, and certainly not the future of our education, without focusing on this population. And we know that English learners face a pretty daunting challenge. They have to learn English, they have to access a curriculum that's still overwhelmingly taught in a language they don't yet comprehend. The achievement outcomes are far from what they should be. The opportunity gaps are huge. Their education is really marked by a significant lack of access to science and social studies and the arts and the college preparatory courses they need. Only 2 out of 3 who enter high school graduate 4 years later, and that graduation gap is increasing. Progress toward an attainment of English proficiency lags, and far too many end up what we call long-term English learners. Kiddos who started in kindergarten or first grade and 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years later still don't have the English proficiency they need for real academic participation. And the thing is, the education of English learners has always been at the crossroads and the crossfires of larger political battles. It's a history that's been marked by cultural and linguistic oppression. It's a history of subtractive education, in which, in a kind of devil's bargain, as students begin developing English, they lose their home language. It's a history that's marked by segregation and marginalization, and the use of IQ tests and later standardized tests in English that conflate low test scores with lack of capacity that justifies relegating them to inferior schooling. And it's a history that gave rise to and gives real meaning to what this new English learner policy is all about. So we're going to look a little bit at that history. And we're going back all the way to 1964, when, after a century or more of civil rights struggle, the federal government passed landmark civil rights legislation ending discrimination on the basis of race and color, religion, sex, and national origin. And in the streets at the time, a vibrant Chicano student movement was walking out of schools and saying, we want schools that teach. And what they were meaning by that, what they were saying in that, was that they were tired of being relegated to remedial courses, tired of discrimination based on their language, tired of a curriculum void of the histories and contributions of their community. And so they called for teachers and counselors who believed in them, access to college prep, bilingual education and ethnic studies. And while that was going on, Up north in San Francisco, on behalf of Chinese American students, parents sued our schools all the way to the US Supreme Court because they said if our kids are in classes taught only in English, they do not have access to equal educational opportunity. So stepping right up, the California legislature, one of the first in the nation to do so, passed what was the strongest Bilingual Education Act. And it simply seemed to them that the fastest route to educational access was to teach kids content in a language they could understand while they were learning English. But the teaching force in California was woefully inadequately prepared to deliver this mandated program. And all throughout the state, people were saying, how are we supposed to do this? What's it supposed to look like? And the courts responded by saying, you guys are the educators, you figure it out, but what we're going to hold you to is 3 things. It better be based on some research and sound educational theory so you could think it would work. Secondly, you have to implement it with sufficient teachers and facilities and conditions and curriculum so it can work. And then over time, you have to show some progress. But the thing is, at that time, there was no research or sound theoretical basis. And so, as the story goes, the phone was ringing off the hook at the California Department of Ed from people in the field saying, what are we supposed to do? And the Bilingual Education Office said, let's pull together the linguists and people doing bilingual education in other countries of the world and ask them what advice they would give to the teachers here. And the group that they pulled together are names that are still recognized in teacher preparation courses. People like linguist Steve Krashen, Jim Cummins, Spencer Kagan. And the ideas they posited included things like language develops in context. So comprehensible input makes a difference. And there's a dual language brain. Kids come with another language, and there's a relationship between that language and what happens in English. And what emerged from them was a theoretical framework for schooling language minority children, which was published and republished and republished and spread across the nation as the basis for building a field. And it was supported, this building of a field, by a huge investment of public funds. Title VII funds from the Fed, state funds, to build capacity, exactly what was needed, professional development, demonstration projects, and then boom. By the 1990s, pushback from teachers about having to get training, pushback from schools about how hard it was to mount these programs, pushback that was uneasy with this notion of bilingualism, and that pushback became backlash in the state. And not so much because of what was happening in the schools, but because of what was happening outside of schools. We were in the midst of an economic recession. We had major immigration, major refugee resettlement going on, and it was changing the demographic mix of the state. And there was a full-fledged pushback against immigration, against immigrants, a public battle over who resources should be spent upon. And then in 1986, in the midst of all of this, an English-only initiative was placed on our ballot, passed by 2-to-1 majority of the voters. And although the courts decreed it had symbolic value only, it ignited a movement here in the state. And that very year, under pressure from that movement, California's Bilingual Bicultural Education Act was allowed to sunset. A few years later, Prop 187 was on the ballot. This time, the voters voting on not wanting public resources used for undocumented children and families. It too was struck down by the courts, but it was part of this backlash. And then in 1998, Prop 227, placed before the voters, aiming to do away with bilingual education. It passed in a bitter and ugly political battle that soured the political climate for bilingual education, and the negative sound bites, the ugly sound bites from that battle are still believed by many in this state 2 decades later. Bilingual programs were abandoned, bilingual books were locked in sheds, teachers were afraid to speak Spanish to their students in particular, and 227 remained the official English learner policy of the state up until last year. And meanwhile, the storm was still building steam. However, it was in that very same election that Prop 10 was passed, with the public overwhelmingly voting to invest in our youngest children, not yet aware that a huge number of those young children were in fact the children of immigrants. In 2001, No Child Left Behind passed, and I have to say, as somebody who is very concerned, like many of us, about equity in our schools, it seemed like the answer. Here it was looking to close achievement gaps. It was looking to shine a bright laser-like beam on underserved subgroups, including English learners. But remember, California was deep in an English-only context and deep in an anti-immigrant era. And that's the context in which No Child Left Behind was being implemented. And as a result, English-only testing and accountability system ended up instituting exclusionary, inappropriate, and very dangerously narrowed curriculum for our English learners. By 2006, when the National Literacy Panel released a major meta-analysis of research about English learners, their findings centered on the crucial role of a child's home language, which was all but banished in California schools. They focused on that bilingual education approaches work equally or better than English-only approaches in terms of English outcomes. And guess what? The kids end up with a whole other language with all of the benefits that accrue from that. But policy, practice, and beliefs here in our Golden State flew in the face of that research. And a decade into the new century, we were seeing very, very disappointing and disturbing results from No Child Left Behind, a widening of the gap of an educational access and achievement for English learners. All of this done unwittingly by educators working really hard, doing what they were supposed to do, being led by education leaders and politicians who just reinforced longstanding patterns of marginalization out of ignorance and being swayed by those larger politics. And there's an important lesson in this for us. But meanwhile, in 2009, under the radar of No Child Left Behind, untouched by that, untouched by Prop 227, the preschool world was really waking up to dual language learners. And the department quietly released Preschool English Learners Principles and Practices, which provided really important research and guidance for the field of early education about the role of home language. And this was the start of a whole series of publications and resources that would emanate from the department over the years to try to nudge focus on dual language learners. And a new era was kind of emerging. After 2 decades of English only and No Child Left Behind, coming down the pike was yet another reform, the Common Core, a breath of fresh air. These standards and the ELD standards that followed them and the wonderful ELA-ELD framework based on those standards were far more research aligned, far more values aligned, more appropriate for English learners, and the framework reintroduced the important role of home language. And by this time, we had our state seal of biliteracy that Glenn spoke about, the first state in the nation to really celebrate the skills of proficiency in 2 or more languages on the diploma of seniors. Dual language programs were beginning to show up in more and more communities throughout the state. And so by 2014, you could tell a change was in the air. Then just last year, in 2017, the National Academies of Sciences released their meta-analysis of research about English learners. And you know what they focused on? The importance of early investment in early education, the years in which language is really developing so powerfully, and the primary grades in education, and that dual language was the best approach during those years. They also importantly pointed to the dangers of language loss in English-only education. That's now wide research consensus. It's not political belief, it's not somebody's opinion. This is research we can hang our hats on. And all of that, accompanied by the passage of Prop 58 by the voters, it was clear a new English learner policy was needed for our state. The old Prop 227 policy was just misaligned with research. It was out of touch with the new attitudes of a 21st century, and it was definitely contraindicated by public mandate through Prop 58. So in July of last year, the State Board of Ed unanimously passed a new English learner policy, the roadmap, superseding Proposition 227 and setting a whole new direction for our state. I'd like you to key up the video, please, because I want to take you there to that room.
Board Member Ortiz-Lacone.
I think this is such a great way to close a very intense day. I was a part of this work group, and I want to just add a personal note to this because I think it's pretty surreal. And I've shared this with some of the members of the committee of the work group. I was a student at UCLA, a student activist protesting Prop 227 when it passed in 1998. And so it's humbling And it's an honor to now sit here and be part of the decision-making to pass a policy that would supersede that, that policy that was adopted in 1998, which really, as a Latina, as a bilingual learner, as an English learner, tried to strip me of my language. And it just brought me stronger to this place. Excuse me. I'm sorry. To have that personal connection to policies that aim to really engage in subtractive schooling of who I was as a student and not validate my experience and my assets. I'm so grateful to God and to everyone else that allowed me to be at this place to now reverse that.
So there were many tears actually in the room that day, unusual for a state board, at least those kinds of tears meeting. And throughout the state, I need to go back to the PowerPoint, please. As people really faced what it meant to be finally turning our page on there we go. And you have palm cards on your table with key elements of the roadmap policy, but I just want to point out a few things about it, what makes it so powerful. The vision of 21st century education that envisions and embraces a system that begins with early childhood and continues all the way through to graduation, including the opportunities all along that way to develop proficiency in multiple languages. And the mission for our schools, that our schools will affirm and welcome and respond to English learners and prepare them for participation in a global, diverse, multilingual world. This roadmap lays out 4 interrelated principles that are research-based, aligned, and intended to get us to this mission. Beginning with number 1, asset-based, needs-responsive schools, rejecting the old deficiency orientation that was so rampant for English learners for so long. The roadmap begins by affirming and embracing the cultures and languages children bring as assets to be welcomed and built upon in their schooling. And principle 2 goes on and commits us to intellectually rich instruction and curriculum and to providing full and meaningful access, breaking from those long-standing patterns of segregation and marginalization and watered-down instruction and narrowed curriculum. This roadmap calls for intellectual rigor and the supports of native language instruction and scaffolding that make that kind of rigor actually accessible to our English learners. And principle number 3, this roadmap recognizes that it takes a system to pull this off, and that we have to invest in building that system and building the capacity to deliver high-quality education. And principle 4 recognizes, once again, that essential early foundation in preschool and the need for alignment and articulation all along the pathways, all along the years of schooling through to graduation and beyond. And across all of this is the promise of an education that reaches for bilingualism and biliteracy, because it's an important 21st century skill, because it provides strong academic outcomes, and because we need to be preparing students to participate in and thrive in and across their multiple language and cultural worlds, accruing to them their rightful connection to home language and culture and the significant, enormous benefits of bilingualism. So here we are. We have a stronger than ever research base. We have solid court and civil rights frameworks to build upon. We have state policy. We have public support for biliteracy, at least for some kids, and a formal end to the era of subtractive English-only schooling. And the thing is, we know how to do it right. We know what instruction looks like. We know what curriculum looks like. We know what good programs look like. So hooray, it really is a new era in all of those ways. And yet, this is a 21st century visionary state policy in a local control era, in a system with inadequate capacity and English-only beliefs that are still bubbling below the surface. We're up against some major challenges to make of this new policy more than just pretty words on a page, but to actually implement it and to turn around those decades of inferior schooling for English learners. So first, think about what it's going to take to move this policy forward in all of those local conversations where decisions are being made about resources and priorities, and ask, are there voices at the table that really speak from and for the needs of English learners? We have to make it so. The urgency right now is to address head-on those persistent belief systems that still persist, that negate what a child's language really means in their learning and education and development. The urgency is to retool teachers and administrators who have been schooled through 2 decades of English-only, no child left behind era, with the kind of professional development and leadership development that helps them make the big shift. The urgency is to not only invest in early childhood education, which we have to be about, but to do so with a clear understanding of who the kids are, and that dual language learners require an approach that really honors who they are and their languages and cultures. The urgency is to mount together a voice for adequate funding for our schools, to see to it that California builds a meaningful and fair accountability system and avoids recreating the kind of English-only accountability system that de-incentivizes and punishes the very dual language approaches called for by the roadmap and the voters of the state. And the urgency is to stand with and for our immigrant communities in a time of attack. So yes, this could be the era where we show to the nation what truly inclusive, affirming, high-level education looks like from birth all the way through graduation and beyond. But what we know is that it will not be such a moment without the determination and intention to make it so, without investment to enable it to be so, without leadership that sees to it that it's done, and without all of us insisting that it be so. Thank you. Can I bring my pen?
Oh my gosh, I never get tired of listening to Dr. Olson. Let's give her another hand.
Thank you.
I'd now like to invite our panelists to the stage. So joining us is Sarah Neville Morgan, who is the Director of Early Education and Support Division at the California Department of Education. She has a long history with early childhood, and her prior life included her work at First 5 California and also at the Department of Education, focused on child development policy. We have Dr. Anya Horowitz, who is the Executive Director of the Sobrato Early Academic Language Model. She has worked as a teacher, a school leader, a district administrator for preschool through early college, and has served in the nonprofit educational sector in New York City and California. We have Hilda Maldonado, who is the Senior Executive Director of Diversity, Learning, and Instruction at Los Angeles Unified School District. She was a bilingual teacher, a principal, various administrative roles, and she also previously served as the Executive Director of the Multilingual, Multicultural Education Department. And finally, we have Maxine Sangapolitelli, who is an English learner, English language development and English language arts teacher at Grossmont Union High School District. She has served as an EL coordinator, established an EL task force, and has supported newcomer programs among a number of initiatives. Please welcome our panelists. Okay, is this on? Can you hear me? How about now?
Yes.
All right. So I'm inspired this morning and super excited to get this panel started. Before we do, though, I just want to let you know that you have note cards on your table. We will be taking your questions for Q&A. We'll be embedding them in the discussion, so staff will be around, so just hold up your cards if you have questions. So as we begin, we had Glenn share with us about the California Way and the landscape that included Global California 2030. We had Dr. Olson that just really gave us the rich history of the English learner education in the state. And for us, the English Learner Roadmap state policy is really the overarching umbrella of all the work that we are doing in early childhood and TK-12 and beyond in terms of what we need to be doing and what we need to be aligning in, right? So Dr. Olson talked a lot about how we need to really get to action. And so part of what that means is we need to understand what does that really look like in the field. So I wanted to start with early childhood and talking with Sarah a little bit about her perspective on what does this mean to bring the English Learner Roadmap policy to the early childhood field and ensuring that we're really giving meaningful access to our dual language learners that is developmentally appropriate and really rich in the cultural and linguistic assets of our kids.
Thank you. So I'm going to, first I'll just start with a quick opening in that the first 5 years of my life were spent in Venezuela and Peru. So very much immersed in learning multiple languages from an early age. So I do feel it's important. And both of my daughters went through a bilingual program in Davis. So it is core. I think a lot of us live and walk and breathe the need for this. But I also want to highlight sort of 3 pieces of implementation, right? Because a document's only as good as it's actually being utilized as more than something on a shelf, or in my case, something to cover up the vents in my floor because it gets really cold in my office. So in truly implementing this, I feel so blessed that the Early Learning and Care Division is within the Department of Education because we are part of that educational continuum. So as you look at the roadmap, you'll see very much that early learning is a part of it, so that it acknowledges all of that brain research. And we know in looking at the brain research that earlier is better. So I think a lot of people thought that infants should only have one language, and we now know from the brain research that they are actually the most capable at learning multiple languages, and it creates multiple pathways that give them more skills and abilities than someone who is just learning one language. And so earlier is better, and more than one is better. And I think we've sort of swung pendulums in multiple ways from only your home language to only English, back to only one, and now really saying all children would do better if they were bilingual. And we can look at other countries and sort of be ashamed that you can live in Europe and in a global competitive marketplace learn 3 to 5 languages. And so the 1 is not enough, maybe 2 is not even enough, but how do we really promote that brain development? For us in the Early Learning Care Division, I will say, so I'm going to hold up something else, our strategic plan was just released. And when you look at the alignment across the strategic plan and the roadmap, they're very much aligned. Because part of what we all say across it is that alignment for systems is really important. So having those silos does not work. We know that for our children, we know that for our providers, and we know that for ourselves. So that alignment across various plans and efforts is really key as we look towards implementation. So alignment is one, integration is the other, so that we don't have multiple sort of projects and initiatives sitting side by side, but how are we taking this roadmap and integrating it into something? So a point that I can highlight for that is our quality rating and improvement system. So we all know with Quality Counts California, at the local level, how are those quality improvement efforts around supporting dual language learners, around promoting bilingualism as an asset, integrated into Quality Counts California? So we're actually updating all of our contracts so that as our contractors see stuff, they will see more and more sort of required coordination across those efforts. But we've also got some wonderful local models. So I'm just going to highlight Fresno, who has done a lot around this. Not only do they have their own dual language efforts, but they also are working on their QRIS, really requiring some components for professional development. San Mateo has a very deep model and also has made that core to their quality rating improvement system. And San Francisco has a lot going on. Those aren't the only ones, but those are some of the ones to look to as we look at models for integrating that. And then lastly, because I know I would take everyone's time and I can't, is as we look at sort of where we go in the future, I am so excited to announce that at the department we are putting $5 million into, over the next sort of 18 months, dual language learner and bilingualism supports. So we've been working very closely with Early Edge, thank you Early Edge, and some others to ensure that we have what we need moving forward. So you'll see some professional development opportunities roll out. So working with SEAL as one of them, working with the GLAD in Southern California. some opportunities there, expanding what Fresno's been doing to be more of a Central Valley project, and that one incorporates infants and toddlers, which is sort of rare in this field and needs to be expanded. And then really working with, I don't know if Carola's here, but with Channel Islands around workforce development, because we know if we actually want to make some changes, the higher education system has to change. The course content must include information on supporting bilingualism and how teachers can go into a classroom if they themselves don't speak the language, but can still promote home language. And we also know that a lot of our programs have 10 or more languages, and 57 to 63, there's sort of different facts out there, of our children are in families that speak a language other than English. So these are California's young children, and our workforce must be supported to promote their home language while also strengthening their English language skills.
Thank you so much. So now we'll move to hear from Hilda Maldonado with LA Unified. Can you talk a little bit about how our state policy, today's current policy, the English Learner Roadmap, what does that mean for districts? How does that help you do your work differently in districts? And can you talk a little bit about what that looks like across your, you also engage in preschool, but across your continuum at a district level?
Yes, good morning, everyone. I am going to take a step back to your question a little bit, though, and go back to Lori's presentation. I started working as the director of multilingual, multicultural education in 2011-12. Before Prop 58, before there was this conversation about how to best serve our English learners. And at that time, we had close to 40,000 English learners in grades 6 through 12 that were considered long-term English learners. And I believe that's about the time your publication came out, Lori's work on long-term English learners. And as I looked at the work that we did in middle and high school, because all my experience has been in elementary school, and found out that our students were actually enrolled in the same classes that a recently arrived English learner came to, I realized that our system answer to what to do with English learners was not there. And so for the last 6 years, we've worked really diligently at ensuring that we put into practice a lot of what the recommendations of Lori Olson's work was around what to do around long-term English learners, and it really taught me a lot about how we really have failed our students. I don't have a lot of pride in saying that we had so many students in grades 6 to 12 as long-term English learners, who I know many of which ended up dropping out of school or just being in classrooms that definitely did not meet their needs. And so because of that experience and trying to figure out how to implement classes to separate them and really give them what they needed, I thought a lot about how our system was set up in K-5 to prevent long-term English learners and trying to find answers for how to best serve English learners in a K-5 system and prevent them from becoming long-term Ls. And then I had to figure out in a 6 through 12 system how to intervene for those students who did become long-term English learners. So we worked a lot on this idea of prevention and intervention, constantly trying to find the answers to an intractable problem, only to realize in the last year or so that it really was about validation. And how is it that we validate who our students are and who we serve in school systems? And how do we create a school system that really looks at children from the early ed all the way to 12th grade? Because we were just bleeding students, if you can put it that way. So as I thought about that, and as I looked at some of the work we were doing with the California English Learner Roadmap, it really led us to that principle number one, which is this idea that an assets-based school system starts with who the students are. LA Unified in 2011-12 was still stuck in this idea that if a student was an English learner in grades 6 to 12, they were an ESL student. Not realizing that many of those students were actually US born, they were not all immigrants, they were not all recently arrived, and yet we kept acting as if we were serving this population. So this idea of a needs-based and assets-oriented policy really resonated with us. We also, last year, I want to highlight Dean Tagawa, who's here, our Director of Early Ed. And he and I partnered together to put together a dual language pilot. We started with 10 schools, 8 Spanish dual language and 2 Korean. Now, I'm not going to be apologetic about the fact that 78% of the English learners in LA are actually Latino Spanish speakers. And yet, many of our dual language programs are not necessarily serving those students. So that's something that we still need to work on in Los Angeles. We also, so with that, we started to really expand our dual language offerings. We've gone from 40 programs to 140 in 5 years. And that was in large part due to us talking to principals and parents about bilingual education and dual language, and realizing that I am now the oldest administrator in the room, and that many of our principals don't know anything about bilingual education or don't recall that, because there's like several generations we've lost with knowledge around what these programs do for our students, and realizing that really our principals wanted to know, so what are the benefits of bilingual education? Why is this good for our students? And having to retrain a whole group of people is another way that we've been able to really work on some of this expansion. And then some of the learnings from dual language, I was talking to Dean this morning, thank you, Dean, that the grandparents of these children in dual language are saying to us that they finally have the human connection that they've always wanted with their grandchildren. Parents are coming to us and saying, my father was not involved in my education because they didn't know what to do in an English-only environment, but I'm so glad that now they have a connection with my child. And at the end, that is what this work is really about. It's about people and working with language and culture that connects us all.
Thank you. The other thing, though, that you guys did was you revamped your English learner master plan.
Yeah, but I was getting the stop sign from him, so I couldn't talk about it.
Thank you, Chris. We have a great timekeeper here. But I think it's really important to just briefly, if you can do a quick overview of how you brought the English learner roadmap to your district.
So we just rewrote our English learner master plan, learning from the 2012 implementation. We started with using the same 4 guiding principles that the state document uses. We added 2 for LA that we felt were really important for us to highlight. So we have also 6 principles: assets-based education, bilingualism and biliteracy, again, because our administrators don't really understand that work, sociocultural competence, alignment and articulation, rigorous academics for all, and systemic support. And we basically looked at the principles in the EL roadmap to inform us, as well as talking to groups of people all across our 1,000 schools in LA, talking to parents, teachers, principals, community advocates. And really, it was a work of the whole community, both inside and outside the system, coming together to write a plan that was really focused on what our students bring first, and then how the system responds to that, rather than the other way around. So this has really been helpful for us as a system to implement. The key, though, like was said earlier, is how to operationalize and implement this work. Because we can write a beautiful document, it'll be there, but really operationalizing it and implementing it and informing the public and our parents about what's available is the biggest lift that we can make as a state and as a district.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. So now I'd like to ask Anya so you have been involved in implementation of programs for English learners, both across preschool through early elementary and all over the state. So from that perspective, can you talk a little bit about bringing the spirit of the roadmap? What is it? What is the operationalizing some of that, and maybe a little bit of background on SEAL?
Great. Yes. So SEAL stands for the Sobrato Early Academic Language Model, and the SEAL model was designed to take what we knew. It began being designed by Dr. Olson and in 3 schools, and they're feeder preschools. So it was designed to be a preschool through 3rd grade model, really to take the research and enact it. What is this going to look like? How can we bring life into what we know is best practice and what we know flies in the face of almost so many of our programs and our classrooms. The model began being piloted in 2008, and we are now in over 100 sites across 20 districts throughout California, many different contexts from LAUSD to the Central Valley, to Davis, to the Bay Area. So we're in many different contexts, and we really work to enact this best practice with the larger vision of really changing the paradigm in California. So our goal is to understand that English learners have historically been served as an add-on, as a supplemental program, as a part of the day or a pullout. And yet we look at these demographics, 60% of our students come with languages other than English spoken at home, and they're not the periphery, right? They are our students, and in many of our schools, that's even much higher numbers. So what does it mean to build classrooms and school systems that support these students at the core of what they're doing? In that, we want to really understand that our students are assets, the languages they bring are assets, not deficits. And so we're working across the preschool system and the K-12 or elementary school system. One of the key core principles around SEAL is that language develops in and through everything that we do. We know this from research. Language develops best in the context of authentic learning. Language is also the core to child development overall. So what does that mean? What does it mean to build teachers' capacity to understand that language is developed in and through everything? What does it mean to build on the assets of home language? So what does it look like to mount multilingual programs, dual immersion programs? What does it mean to serve 7, 8, 10 different languages in your classroom? But understanding that their home language development is critical. This is not something that we have really a choice to do. It's essential. The research is clear that it's essential that if students don't develop their home language, their English language proficiency is going to lack, as well as the loss of their home language skills. So another piece that I think is really important and that is key to why SEAL resonates with so many educators and teachers. We say in SEAL that we take joy very seriously, but it's true. And we joke about it, but one of our key goals is joyful learning. And when I say that to a group of preschool educators and elementary school teachers, sometimes there's always a few people that actually start to tear up, that we're talking with them and saying, at the core of what kids need to be experiencing is joyful learning. That notion is, absolutely. So our goal in SEAL is really to bring that to life. And so what we've learned across many different classrooms, across many different systems, the work is complex. It's not simple. You don't send your teachers off and then hope and pray that they're going to come back and change their practice. So we focus on sustained job-embedded professional development. It takes time. We have a 2-year implementation process. Our trainers are the most incredible trainers in the state of California, absolutely. We work with them to train them and to get them up to speed. But the magic is not in the training. The magic is in the teachers coming back and applying that learning together, so they don't work classroom by classroom, they work across grade levels, across all the preschool classrooms in a system. And it's in that application, just like our kids, as our kids apply their learning, that's where the learning, the magic happens. It's in that for teachers. And in terms of our approach to enacting research-based, we're very focused on research-based practice for adults as well. So we know from implementation research that we have to share the ownership of implementation. So what does it look like for a teacher? What does it look like for a coach? What does it look like for a preschool director, for a principal, for district leaders? So it's really in that shared ownership that we can see the capacity built and then the implementation take hold.
Thank you. And I just want to highlight, you talked about job-embedded training. That includes early childhood educators. I mean, I don't think, we've been asking in early childhood to find ways to bring more professional development opportunities, right? And so it's been really wonderful to see Los Angeles Unified and Long Beach Unified and Fresno. I mean, there are all these places where that is being prioritized. And we are so grateful to have the $5 million to bring more of that training. But that is something that we need to work together on and getting more of these investments in our early childhood, because we have that in K-12. The opportunities for professional development days and all that kind of thing. And so that's been a really great thing to see in the implementation of these programs. So now we will hear from Miss Maxine, who brings a teacher's lens, right? And she also brings a secondary lens on that. And so Maxine, can you tell us a little bit about your perspective as a teacher? What does it mean to have this English Learner Roadmap state policy in place? How does it help you do what you know is right for kids? And moving from a deficits-based framework to an assets-based one, what does that look like in the classroom for you?
So before I start, I just want to know how many teachers are in the room. Can I see show of hands, my teachers? So I started teaching in 2003, right in the middle of the deficit-based policy. And I didn't really understand the history, but I was always really interested in culture and language. And I was looking at some of the things that we were doing to our students, and it just didn't seem appropriate, it didn't seem right. The notion that a student has to be or acquire English or be proficient in English or have reasonable fluency in English before they can learn grade level content just seemed really strange to me. And they were isolated and they were marginalized. And I was looking at some of the language that was being used by my colleagues and teachers just in the region of they can't do this, they're really low, this student is low. And it just was really tough for me because as a new teacher I was really excited, and then jumping into that I'm thinking, whoa, this is different than I thought it would be. And then it got even tougher when I joined my master's program at San Diego State University, because it was all about critical pedagogy and access and equity for English learners and minority students. And so I would go there and I would learn about the history that Lori shared with us. And I learned about bilingual education. And I learned about this notion of you learn content and language simultaneously, and that our students are coming to us with rich linguistic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. And so my students predominantly speak Spanish and Arabic. So I went to community college and I learned Arabic so that I could communicate with my students. And it just opened my eyes to what they were bringing, the assets that they were bringing. So I was using that in my classroom as a teacher. And so I saw how they were, when they were in the sheltered English immersion programs, which I taught, they were excluded from A through G courses. And they were excluded from AP and honors courses. And this is still happening today. This is not just in the past. And they were excluded from AVID. I don't know if you guys know what AVID is, but it's a program that helps them go straight from high school to university. And I was watching this population of students, especially the Arabic speakers from their country in Iraq. College was free. So they came here with the expectation that everyone goes to college. And so I'm watching them be excluded from AVID. And so I got together with some colleagues of mine, the AVID team and the other ELD teachers, and we thought of how can we get a cohort of students, accelerate them from sheltered English immersion and get them into the AVID program. So we worked really hard to do that, and we got a lot of pushback and there was a lot of backlash. But the very first cohort had 3 students, and the one student got accepted into 5 universities. And he started in like high beginning ELD, and he went all the way to be accepted in 5 universities. And so I thought about the system a lot during that time. You know, groups of teachers can empower each other and administrators and work together, but the whole system should be set up that way. And then I look at my school community, and our students are coming with Arabic, Farsi, Spanish, Swahili, but in our neighboring, more affluent area, they get access to dual language programs that they don't have access to in my community. So now I brought the roadmap, because of my affiliation with this group, I brought the roadmap back to my school. And our professional learning is rooted in the roadmap. And it's not just about access and equity. It's really that that term meaningful access just resonates with me, because you can give someone access, but if it's not meaningful, then it really isn't going to be impactful, right? So we have to really focus on that. So I want all of our professional learning to be just grounded in the roadmap, because when we come up to some of that negative narrative language, we can go, whoa, that's not what, you know, I can pull this out. Be like, no, that's not what this is saying, right? And so what I've done is I've tried to create, and I'm still in the works of creating a roadmap classroom, where it is a community of learners who are encouraged to use their home language and encouraged to use their prior experiences. I have students, because I teach high school, I have students who are already in the workforce in other countries. You know, so they're bringing those skills and those assets to my classroom so they can be leaders in my classroom. And so we have a lot of work to do, as everyone is saying, but I think that together, systematically, if we all work together, then it is definitely possible.
Thank you so much. Wonderful, wonderful. Oh my gosh, there's so many questions to get through. So while we are, well, let me ask an aspirational question. So we talked yesterday about our next state superintendent, and we're going to have a new governor. And so when we think about what we need to do to move the needle, what kind of leadership do we need from our next governor and our next state superintendent? From an early childhood perspective, from a district perspective, from a birth to 12 perspective, or going across the continuum, from a teacher's perspective. So if we can get through a lot of questions, that would be great. So if we can just, what is your top recommendation for that?
So I think we need to continue what our current state superintendent has done around all of this support for bilingualism and move forth the goal of 2030 so that all of our children in California are bilingual. It creates a very competitive California in a global market. And at the same time, we need to really support our higher ed system to incorporate the knowledge and the content in their courses so that all of our teachers come out. So teachers themselves, I think it's wonderful you went back to school and learned Arabic. Our teachers should be bilingual. So how do we create that workforce that themselves not only understands how to promote home language in another language, but then they are also bilingual. So having a governor who can really support and move forth that in partnership with the superintendent, I think is what's needed. And I will always say, because that's where I live, that it has to start with those families and our early learning and care providers so that it moves all the way up through the entire system.
Thank you.
I would say that we need courage and clear and consistent communication about the importance of our state. We're very close to Mexico, Central, South America, and the Pacific Rim, and I think as a state we have a lot of strength in that. I would like to see that our governor and our superintendent become the voice of who our students are. We have a large workforce that can be very powerful, and operationalize that diversity. I really feel strongly that if the governor and the superintendent can be clear and have the courage to say it like it is. We're in an interesting time in the history of this government in the United States, and I think if they could lift the voices of education and the importance of a public education and how it does close that achievement gap for many of us, including myself. I came here at the age of 12. I never dreamed that I would be sitting here talking to you about this issue. I never started thinking that way. And I had to go through my own process of living in fear to having pride in my culture and in my language, and also feeling a lot of shame to having a lot of courage to be able to speak up about this. And I think we need those voices around us to really help make our state strong.
Go ahead.
Or you're going down the line, or? Okay.
Pop in.
So I think it's not an accident that this state's leadership stood up with safe schools, sanctuary schools, with the English Learner Roadmap at the very time that there is a national real backlash against immigrants. And I think that there's a moment of California stepping up, kind of the way you're talking about it, Elda, and saying, we're going to be a place that holds the line and paints a different kind of vision. I'm looking for a governor in a state soup that really owns that and that recognizes that how important it is to do that, to voice it, to articulate it, and then back it up and recognize to get us from where we are in practice to achieving that vision requires huge investment. We cannot get there. And so this is where today's panel marries with what people were talking about yesterday. But it's not just about we need more money for our schools. It's like to get the capacity, to build the capacity, to pull off this shift requires an extra amount of investment. And I would really hope that our governor and state soup are voices for that.
And I'll just build off of that to add that I think it's critical that we hold our politicians to this notion of the complexity. This is not a simple issue, right? We talked about the workforce issues in preschool. We have workforce issues in K-12 still, even though we think we're that much better off than the preschool system. We have funding issues. We're talking about really robust, incredible vision for education in terms of our new standards, our framework, the roadmap. And yet that's complex work. This isn't simple work to be done. So what is it going to mean? This isn't going to be politically expedient, right? This is not something that a politician can hang their hat on. It's not universal preschool or dual language learning, right? It's not early childhood or K-12. It has to be a really aligned approach. And so holding that complexity is going to be critical, I think, in this next era.
Can I add one more thing? You just reminded me, too, that we need to have the whole community, including the publishing community, helping us, because there's a lot of money to be made in publishing materials for our students. And I think, as with SEAL, we're seeing that how does everyone support our students? And a governor or a superintendent that holds those folks accountable, too, to some of the work that our teachers need, so they can feel that collective efficacy in themselves to support our students is very important. Thank you.
Please, jump in.
So when the Common Core came out, there was a lot of buzz, a lot of excitement around that. And I know we laugh now, but I think that there should be the same level of buzz and excitement. And there was a state investment there, and there should be a state investment for this too, because otherwise it's going to come across as one more thing, when really the EL roadmap is not one more thing. It's the one thing that ties it all together. I, as a teacher, have read all of the ELD standards. I use them to plan my lessons. I have read the framework, and it is, almost 1,000 pages. And I have read it. I am one of those outliers or something weird, I don't know. But I think that for us to have that on top of our regular job, we need that support so that we can digest that and understand that. And I think that the roadmap really helps us do that. It's really concise and clear and positive.
Thank you.
I will always go back to, we are the 5th largest world economy. That is insane when you think about it. Yeah. So California, not only are we currently leading the way, but we should be so forcefully coming out and keeping the momentum, and as everyone said, investing back in them. As the 5th largest world economy, we can't afford to drop down to 10th because other people can do more with us. We have to, and I went on a trip to China, and my biggest takeaway was, do it.
Yeah.
They are on us, do it.
So I'm gonna ask kind of a tougher question in terms of reclassification is a big concern for English learners, right? So families face an immediate barrier in reclassification. This tends to be a focus when we think about English learners. That is also about English language proficiency, which is one part of the conversation, and we're trying to get to a place where we're having a more holistic conversation, but that's something that families really struggle with. They're very concerned about. Sometimes families don't even want to say that their kids are English learners because they don't want them to get the label, and then they don't have the support. So can you talk a little bit about how we are thinking about or addressing reclassification? What should we be talking to in the field? What should we be telling our parents? How do we support this to be the productive conversation that we're having here, and also addressing these fears that families really have?
I think I can speak a little bit to that. I know that in going back to our master plan, our prior plan just talked about getting kids to reclassification. And this new plan talks about from identification to reclassification to graduation. Because it's got to be the whole way through. It's not just about being reclassified, it's also about having the skills you need to graduate. And as we worked on that a lot in Los Angeles, there is a lot of things that need to be worked out in terms of timing of testing for our students, in terms of the tests that we're using to determine whether or not they reclassify, and then in terms of what teachers understand about what comes first. It's sort of a chicken and egg. Does language come before literacy, or does literacy come before language? Because in the reclassification criteria, we're looking at both. And so we've done a lot of work in LA around ensuring that our teachers understand that it has to be both at the same time. And this is why it's also important to look at bilingual education as the best program for English learners, because English learners in English-only programs, about 56% by elementary are reclassified, and those are the kids that come with lots of language experience, lots of ways to really access dual language. The students that are left behind really need a rich program around language, which is why we know that SEAL would work for these types of students that need that help. But this idea that if you can't speak in English, you're somehow cognitively delayed or somehow not able to think is really a backwards way of thinking about the work. And also this idea that once you reclassify, you've met the pinnacle of success is also another conversation we need to get away from, because beyond reclassification, there's still all the A through G requirements that our kids need to access and have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would add to that, referencing what Maxine was talking about, one of the problems with being not reclassified yet and being labeled an English learner is because in most practice, it means you don't have access to a bunch of other classes. And I think the O'Donnell bill that passed this year and was just signed by the governor, assuring that English learners will get full access, I think that the roadmap, that kind of way of thinking in schools, which is whether you're an English learner or not, you're going to have access to all these classes, so that you're not getting dinged, you're not getting hurt by not being reclassified. In fact, you're being helped because hopefully you're getting the services you need. Mm-hmm. And I think reframing it that way, as well as what Ilda was saying about, it's about so much more than reclassification.
Absolutely,
as
absolutely.
a goal. Yeah.
But so on the other hand, or bilingual education, obviously we know that's, if we could all have that, I would love to be, know so many more languages than I do. But not every parent will select a bilingual program. And even if they all did, not every teacher has a language other than English to provide that language, to support that home language as a proficient bilingual person, for example. But that doesn't, we know through a lot of your work that you don't have to be fluent in another language to provide this kind of education to our students. So can you talk a little bit about what is that for the English dominant teacher who really, she's here, she's listening to this and she says, yes, I'm with you, but I don't speak that language, what can I do? Can you talk about that?
So one of the things we did with our teachers of long-term English learners is we went back to looking at the assessment for English language proficiency. And what we found is that many of our teachers needed to really understand the grammar of English as a content area. And once teachers understood what that looks like, they were able to transfer that skill to understand what was happening with our students. We used a lot of the core assessments as well, so that the teacher could really focus on where in the language proficiency and in the literacy proficiency that students need to acquire were their needs. So an example is we looked at reading comprehension strategies that we know work with all students, like reading things 2-3 times. I'm going to school right now, I need to read them like 5 times sometimes to really understand the content. And so our teachers, our upper grade teachers don't have training in some of those early literacy skills, and if they get students at those levels, they need to understand that. They need to understand the basics of English. My first language is Spanish. I cannot explain to you how to convert, from a verb to an action. I can't even say it. I don't know how to explain it. It's just my language. And it's the same for someone that speaks English. How do you explain how English works? And why you say things a certain way? And so our teachers need to be equipped with understanding how language works and how language is used. And so to our point earlier, if all our teachers understand that, then it doesn't matter if you're teaching them in a bilingual program or an English-only program. You understand what's happening language-wise with your students. You can also understand when kids speak to you a particular way, if they're using a sentence in the wrong grammatical structure or the wrong syntax, you can help students understand that difference. But we don't teach our teachers in that manner because we're starting with a different assumption in our teacher education programs. And we're starting with the average student, which doesn't exist. And so I think that's a large part of where our higher ed programs need to also change.
Yeah. Lori?
Yeah, I think number one, parents and families are powerful in this, and to the degree that we enlist them in understanding the importance of their home language and how to support home language and build home language, that partnership is something every teacher should be engaged in building, including getting help from those families about understanding some of the basic phrases, et cetera. So that you can get that partnership, and then there's a continuum from affirmation all the way to building biliteracy. A teacher who does not speak the language of the students is not going to create biliteracy, where they're really using it for academic purposes. But the affirmation of language, the ways to bring a child's language into the classroom and into their learning are strategies any teacher can use. But the other thing that is really important is to think about our staffing patterns in somewhat different ways. You can have an English a teacher who only speaks English paired with a teacher who is proficient in another language, and they swap their kids for parts of things. So thinking about how to use what capacity we have as a system is a really important way of getting us there. But I think we should not fool ourselves. You do not get to biliteracy unless you have teachers that have high levels of proficiency in those languages. But you can get to a system that embraces and affirms the languages of all kids.
And I'll just add, to build off of the story you shared, Vicki, earlier, kids, they get it right off the bat. You know, the minute they begin developing and understanding, they're social scientists, right, detecting the world. And so even if your friend's child wasn't necessarily able to go to a dual immersion program, preschool program, how that environment holds language and really can validate and bring, as Lori said, families into the classroom, play music of different cultures and languages. All of those pieces, we can build schools and systems that validate multilingualism in ways that, and then partner with families in ways that are also really quite powerful. And teachers, you know, we're ingrained in this, we have baggage. And so it really takes ownership, it's not just the teacher, it has to be owned at all levels with the partnerships with families.
Thank you. Okay, so one last question. We're here at the Birth to 12th Grade Conference. Can you talk a little bit about the continuum and how we need to, we talk about differentiation in education all the time, right? But when we're talking about language development, we also have to understand, like, the strategies are similar, but being developmentally appropriate for across a continuum is really important. Can you talk a little bit about what are some of those considerations when you look at an early childhood setting versus when you're looking at an elementary setting and even secondary? Like, what are some of those considerations?
So I'll just say in SEAL we work, as we've noted, we work in preschool through now 5th grade. And so we think about this continuum and articulation. We know that our students have historically been in ping pong programs and interventions and approaches. And so this issue around really having a clear, articulated program and pedagogy is critical. And so we think about, for example, hands-on learning, play-based learning, you know, kids really getting their hands dirty, looking at things, pretending to be at a, I'm blanking on the term, but scientists, really archaeologists, playing into that, and then what that looks like in the upper grades as scientific hands-on inquiry and multiple experiments happening at the same time, so that play-based learning has a continuum into what we're doing around project-based learning and science and so forth. We talk about what does it look like what does rich interaction with text look like in preschool, and how does that continuum build where kids are really owning the text, they're making choices about the text and so forth. So how do you build those strategies through? And one of the pieces I think that's key for us is taking some of the incredible best practice in early childhood and actually helping our early elementary, but even upper elementary, understand that. What does it mean to really connect with your students? What does it mean to really do that cooperative learning and that play-based learning? How does that evolve over time and so forth? So it definitely takes time and energy, and this issue of coherence building is critical. What does it look like for a teacher, and how do we build, even within a grade level and preschool, how do we build coherence in all the things that are coming at teachers? And then how do we do that so that our preschool and our elementary school or K-12 systems understand each other and how that reacts? And that's, even in districts that run their own preschool systems, the preschool director doesn't go to the cabinet. So he doesn't sit with the rest of the leaders. The articulation is not happening, and we really need to work on that.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the
last 10
baby.
seconds.
So I will say that early childhood does this really well in that we are play-based, we are very much in that, and the family engagement is core. And so that's something that we've always sort of stressed and emphasized, the partnerships with families, the strengthening of families, as well as the community engagement. So actually listening to you, Anya, everything you said is what early childhood lives and breathes. What we haven't done as well is the intentional support of home language and second language development. So only those few pockets, how do we really embed that? And knowing that most of our programs have many, many languages. So you'll have a classroom that has 10 or more languages spoken. So how are you strengthening the skill set of the workforce, providing professional development days? Yay, AB 2626, 2 professional development days, finally. But we obviously have much farther to go in getting those resources to early childhood.
Thank you. So our time is up. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. Just a quick recap. So we talked about all educators being educators of dual language learners and English learners, this new exciting state policy and really being intentional about bringing it into our classrooms, into our early childhood programs, the critical need to invest in our workforce so that we can equip them to support our children, how important it is to define quality that really reflects our kids, and again, the resources that we need to make sure that's in place. Before we close, I want to show a really quick clip. So if we can go, it just exemplifies and it brings kids into this space about exactly what we're talking about. Go ahead.
A student thrives when they have an aligned set of educational experiences, when the approach to learning is consistent throughout their educational experience.
Let's work on our first sentence.
The word is rasposa, like...
Oh, so how do we say that in English?
The wood is smooth. Rough. Smooth.
Can we say the wood is rough?
The wood is rough.
When we create a space for students to make those cross-language connections and to bring their whole linguistic repertoire, we create an environment in which students are more able to effectively learn both of the languages that they're learning in school and to be more successful.
¿Cómo se dice paleontólogo en inglés? Son los cognados. Entonces es lo bonito de los dos idiomas, que podemos aprender algo en un español y lo podemos hacer la conexión en inglés. Es el puente o es la conexión.
¿Cómo se dice? Erupciones. Pero en inglés. Eruptions. Sí, así, ajá. También es eruptions.
Teachers need to be provided
the resources, including time, but also support via coaching and collaboration in order to enact the ELA-ELD framework. Without honoring the need that the teachers have, we cannot see the shift that we want to see in the classroom.
So that sums it up quite well. I think that video was courtesy of Seal. Thank you so much. So let's thank our panelists.